Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this celebration of the life and legacy of the great Constance Baker Motley, civil rights lawyer, democracy pioneer, New York State Assembly woman, first woman borough president of Manhattan, and jurist on the Southern District of New York Federal Court. She also, of course, was a hero and inspiration to so many of us. I first met Judge Motley when I was dispatched to contact her by Julius Chambers, then the director counsel at LDF. I was a young lawyer at LDF at the time, and I was pregnant with my first child. And I was trying to think through how I would have my child and continue to be a civil rights litigator. Julius Chambers said I should go see Judge Motley, and I reached out to her. And to my surprise, she warmly received me, invited me to lunch, and that began our relationship. I looked up to her. I found that she was an extraordinary person, cool, calm, always self possessed. And if you met her, it was hard to understand everything that she had accomplished because she was so open and warm. We wanted to make sure we had the opportunity to celebrate her today on what would have been her 100th birthday. And I want to thank the Associate Director Counsel of LDF, Janae Nelson, whose brainchild was this event. We think it's important to lift up Judge Motley as an extraordinary lawyer and inspiration for so many civil rights lawyers, both men and women, to give people an opportunity who don't know about her life and work to learn about her. So I hope you're going to sit tight for the next hour and listen and learn and enjoy hearing and learning about one of America's great democracy heroes. And first, we have remarks from someone who often talks about Judge Motley as her inspiration. I describe Judge Motley's varied career. This next guest also has had a varied career that very much is in the same tradition. She also is a brilliant lawyer. She served as the district attorney of San Francisco. She was elected as the attorney general of the state of California. And then she was elected as a United States Senator representing the state of California. But we all know her now as the extraordinary Vice President of the United States, where she blazes trails as the first woman Vice President, the first Black woman Vice President, the first Vice President of Asian American descent, and where she brings her excellence, her brilliance, her commitment to justice and to the rule of law to the White House. She stands shoulder to shoulder with President Biden, and she's taken on an extraordinary range of issues with which she feels passionately engaged. She makes us all proud, and she counts Judge Constance Baker Motley as her inspiration. Please join me in welcoming the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you to my friend Sherilyn Eiffel, the Legal Defense Fund's leadership team, and to all those gathered for all that you do. Every day, you fight for justice and equality to the benefit of so many and to the benefit of our country. And every day, you carry on the legacy of leaders like Constance Baker Motley. Constance Baker Motley spent her life defying expectations. She decided to go to law school even after being told that, quote, women don't get anywhere in the law. She helped write the brief for Brown v. Board of Education. She argued 10 cases before the United States Supreme Court, winning 9 of them. And she was the first Black woman appointed to a federal court judgeship, and the only one for more than a decade. So many of us count Constance Baker Motley among our personal heroes. I certainly do. She showed us the power of the law to effect change, and she taught us to see what can be, unburdened by what has been. So today we must call on her wisdom as we carry on the work, and in particular, the work to protect the fundamental right to vote. I don't need to tell you, but this year alone, 18 states have passed 30 new restrictive voting laws. These laws disproportionately impact communities of color, poor communities. These are laws that are designed to make it harder for people to vote. But together with so many of you, President Joe Biden and I are fighting back. We are working to pass the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Together, I know we can get this done. So, on Constance Baker Motley's 100th birthday, we both celebrate her extraordinary legacy and we recommit ourselves to the values she held dear: equality, justice, the right of all people to fully participate in our society and to determine their own futures. Thank you all, and let us enjoy this special day.
Thank you, Vice President Harris, for those wonderful remarks about Constance Baker Motley. And now I'd like to introduce Joel Motley, the son of Constance Baker Motley. He is the managing partner at Public Capital Advisors, LLC. He is also the producer of an extraordinary film about the life of Judge Motley, The Trials of Constance Baker Motley. And you'll see clips from that film throughout the program today. He's been a great supporter and friend of LDF, and we're so thrilled that he was willing to join us and say a few words about the life and legacy of his exceptional mother, Constance Baker Motley. Join me in welcoming Joel Motley.
I'd like to begin today by thanking the Legal Defense Fund for inviting me to speak at today's event honoring the legacy of my mother. If my mother were here today, I know that she would be incredibly proud of the fact that the Legal Defense Fund has the largest desegregation docket outside the US Department of Justice. She would be proud to know that her work desegregating schools in the South in cases like Brown versus the Board of Education and Meredith v. Fair have shaped constitutional law in the United States and shaped civil rights law as well. And finally, she would be honored that the Legal Defense Fund has created the Marshall Motley Scholars Program in her name to seed the South and the country with a new generation of civil rights lawyers who will continue her work for years to come. Thank you, LDF, for hosting this wonderful event celebrating my mother and her important legacy.
Thank you, Joel, for joining us today to celebrate the legacy of your mother. Today's panel is moderated by LDF's Associate Director Counsel, Janae Nelson. As an organizational thought leader at LDF, Nelson works with the President and Director Counsel to determine and execute LDF's strategic vision, oversee the operation of its program, and is a member of LDF's litigation and policy teams. Our first panelist is Dean Tamiko Brown-Nagin. Dean Brown-Nagin is an award-winning legal historian and an expert in constitutional law and education law and policy. She has published many articles and book chapters on a wide range of topics and will explore the life and times of Constance Baker Motley in her upcoming book, Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley and the Struggle for Equality. Our next panelist is Professor Martha Jones. Professor Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and a professor at the SNF Agora Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. She is the author of multiple books, including Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. Our final panelist is Sarah Moss. Moss is Vice Chairman of the Estee Lauder Companies. In her role, she serves as a Senior Advisor to the Board of Directors, Executive Management, and the Lauder family. She co-leads the Women's Leadership Network, is a leader of the Sustainability Executive Committee, and works collaboratively with senior leaders and others across the organization. Moss began her career as a law clerk for the Honorable Constance Baker Motley. Please join me in welcoming Janae Nelson, Dean Tamiko Brown-Nagin, Professor Martha Jones, and Sarah Moss.
Hello, and thank you for joining us to celebrate the 100th anniversary of one of the most remarkable women in American history, Constance Juanita Baker Motley. I could not be more thrilled to mark this special occasion by discussing her important legacy with a brilliant group that we've assembled today. Dean Tamiko Brown-Nagin, Professor Martha Jones, and Sarah Moss. Before we begin, allow me to do a little table setting and provide some background about the illustrious career of Constance Baker Motley. As others have mentioned, one of Constance Baker Motley's most significant distinctions is that when she was confirmed to the bench in 1966, she became the first Black woman to serve as a federal judge. And in fact, her entire career was marked by firsts. She was among the first women to be admitted to Columbia Law School, the first Black woman to argue before the Supreme Court, where she won 9 out of 10 cases that she argued, with the 10th to be overturned in her favor 20 years later in the infamous juror discrimination case, Batson versus Kentucky. She was the first Black woman to serve in the New York State Senate, as well as the first woman to be Manhattan Borough President, and eventually the first woman to be the chief judge of the Southern District of New York. In addition to those extraordinary trailblazing accomplishments, Motley was one of our own. She was a brilliant civil rights attorney at the Legal Defense Fund, where she was again the first woman attorney here and the only woman attorney at LDF for most of her career. Her career at LDF is absolutely legendary. She earned a reputation as the chief courtroom strategist of the civil rights movement. And not only did she serve as the primary architect of the legal strategy for LDF's seminal Brown versus Board of Education litigation, which of course ended state-sponsored segregation of public schools, she also successfully litigated cases that ended segregation in public accommodations and higher education. She pressed for jury discrimination claims. She represented and defended protesters, including Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, Bernard Lafayette, Andy Young, and many other prominent men of the movement. She also litigated voting rights cases, which is a little known fact. And in light of Vice President Harris's call to action, it's only fitting to lift up one of her victories in this area, a 1947 case, Rice versus Elmore, that ended the exclusion of Black voters from Democratic primaries in South Carolina. And during her 20-year tenure at LDF, she litigated countless cases on behalf of marginalized Black communities and individuals across the South, awing white and Black audiences alike. And she went on to become a consequential jurist in one of the most respected circuits in our federal judiciary. So it's no wonder that we are so incredibly proud of Constance Baker Motley here at LDF. And today we celebrate her by discussing the profound impact of her legacy generally on our laws and interpreting our Constitution and our civil rights laws, and on the lives of the exceedingly accomplished women joining me today and her role in shaping our country. So I'd like to begin there. I'd like to begin by asking each of you what Constance Baker Motley's legacy has meant to you personally and professionally. Dean Brown-Nagin, I'll start with you.
Thank you so much, Janae, and thanks to the Legal Defense Fund for inviting me to be a part of this really important panel today. You know, when I think about Constance Baker Motley, personally, she's so accomplished and so remarkable that she brings the whole world into focus. You know, she's the North Star, the one who helps you find your way, the one who reminds you of your worth and your values, the one who reminds you to walk in dignity and in grace, to keep your composure, and above all else, to strive for excellence. That's what she means to me. And professionally, I think about her as opening up the American workplace to women. both through her career as a lawyer, as well as through her achievements on the bench. And yet, to know about her life, her professional life, is to not only think about her accomplishments, it's to think about the challenges. And in my forthcoming book, I talk about the way in which she allows us to ponder matters that are still so relevant today for American women. Sherilyn mentioned being pregnant and going to Judge Motley to help her negotiate that. Well, Judge Motley herself was dealing with pregnancy and on a maternity leave around the same time that she was working on Brown versus Board of Education for LDF. So she helps us think about balancing work and family. In every phase of her career, she was working long hours, which deprived her of the ability to see her son and her husband sometimes. And yet, one of the stories I tell about in my book is how, when she was litigating these cases, at the end of the day, she would always call back to New York City to talk to her husband and her son. And so there's so much that she represents, the physical burdens and emotional burdens of being a civil rights lawyer, of being in danger. There's so much that she represents in her professional life, including, of course, just the loneliness of being the only Black woman judge, the only Black woman in the courtroom so many times.
Oh, thank you, Dean Brownigan. And the words that you used to describe her brilliance and dignity and composure are ones that we hear over and over again associated with her. And it's so important to think about how she held that at the same time that she was holding all of these other personal demands. So thank you for bringing that to the fore. Professor Jones, can you answer the question? What has her legacy meant to you personally and professionally?
Well, thank you, and thanks to everybody at LDF for convening us on this remarkable occasion and the honor of lifting up Constance Baker Motley. I hope I'm not saying too much when I say I think Sherilyn Ifill and I are of the same generation of young lawyers in New York City, looking out in the 1980s to craft our own path. I'm someone who was raised by the generation of Judge Motley in the tradition of civil rights. But of course, by the time we arrive in the 1980s, we have to find new ways. We have to blaze new trails in order to sustain those values. And in that sense, Judge Motley really is a standard bearer, right? Someone who across a long and multifaceted career herself had to adapt, to adjust, respond to the urgencies of the many generations across which she worked. And so for someone like me, it is that necessity that in order to fight the good fight, we must find our own way to do that. And she really represented that for me from the outset. I think one of the other, lesser appreciated chapters in her life is that period in which in the New York State Senate and as Manhattan Borough President, she is fully immersed in politics. I think as a young lawyer, I imagine being something like a gladiator. But what her career reminds us is that in order to get the good work done, there are other moments in which we have to roll up our sleeves and immerse ourselves in the very complicated, very challenging space of politics, and to do so oftentimes seemingly solo, seemingly alone, seemingly the only. So not only are we engaged in advocacy in my work on behalf of homeless New Yorkers and New Yorkers with mental illness, women with HIV and AIDS in the latter decades of the 20th century, we are oftentimes alone in that work and alone in our identities. But I think of Constance Baker Motley as the sort of individual you carry with you. You carry her in your heart, you carry her in your pocket, you carry her in your courage in order to do the work that we must necessarily do. And not all of it, not too little of it happens in front of cameras, in the spotlight, acknowledged and appreciated. So much of that work happens in lonely trenches. And I've been rereading her memoir to remind myself of the ways in which she sustains us in that lonely work behind the scenes that is so essential. I think the last thing I'll say, because I'm someone who began my professional life as an attorney, as a litigator, and today I am an educator, a historian, a writer. It is, again, that versatility of Judge Motley's career that reminds us that when we are fortunate, our professional lives are long, and that we will find many sorts of routes to doing that. Imagine stepping out of LDF and that extraordinary space for defining what the civil rights struggle was, and into the trenches of New York State politics, and then being almost unexpectedly yanked out of those scenes, right, and placed on the federal bench by Lyndon Johnson. I think it's a model for us all about the ways in which our fundamental values, our fundamental training, the people who raised us up, including our own families, give us the kinds of foundations that mean when we have that opportunity, sometimes planned and sometimes not so much, to pivot and continue in the work, we have the capacity to do that. And while my own father was just terrified when I left my law office to become a professor, he was afraid I was going to wind up on his couch without a job. It was women like Judge Motley, right, who reminded me that there were many facets to a professional life, and that I had the foundation and I had the models for making my own meaning and finding my own purpose across what has fortunately been a long career. So thank you again for the opportunity to lift her up.
Well, thank you for pointing out the many facets of her career. They truly represent how much you can do in service of justice and civil rights through various positions. And we are so glad that you lifted up the ones that she's held. Sarah, as one of Judge Motley's former law clerks, you had a personal and professional connection to her from very early on in your career. What has that meant to you?
Yes, she was a role model and a mentor to me personally and professionally. And clerking for her was really the opportunity of a lifetime. And I will always be grateful to my friend Liz Schneider, a former Judge Motley clerk, who recommended me for the position. Judge Motley, I will say, had so many extraordinary law clerks over the years. It's an honor to be here today, but I wish they could all be here to give their insights. She was a hero to me before I began clerking for her. My parents were very involved in the civil rights movement. My father marched with Dr. King and Selma. I was, of course, avidly involved in the civil rights movement and following it. So her work in Brown versus Board of Education and desegregating University of Georgia and Mississippi, Alabama, I knew well. So she was a hero to me before my clerkship. And then to just be with her and work with her and learn from her was just extraordinary. She was remarkable. Thurgood Marshall would come into chambers to have lunch with Judge Motley, and then he'd come out and chat with the law clerks. I practically passed out. He said, "Oh, Connie was just telling me about you." Well, I don't think she was, but I loved that. So just being there and being with her was extraordinary. And she was a role model on the bench and off the bench. She was, as was said, unperturbed. Rude lawyers, pressure, whether or not she felt it, and sometimes she certainly did, but you never saw it. So she was always dignified, always even, always had the courage of her convictions, but presented them in a graceful way with authority and dignity. She had a wry sense of humor. And I don't know if anybody else experienced that, but she did. And I'll just one anecdote that's short. I felt an incredible connection to her. And after I left the clerkship, we would have lunch from time to time. I have 4 children. She would always shake her head, how could you possibly do that with each additional child? But I felt incredibly close to her. When she published her book, Equal Justice Under Law, we were having lunch and I gave her a copy of the book and I said, Judge, would you sign it? So she signed it to my favorite, Sarah Moss, my favorite law clerk. I said, oh, Judge, that means so much. She said, I write that for all my law clerks. So that was, but completely deadpan. And that's who she was. She had a strong family. And of course, Joel was in college when I was clerking, but her husband, Joel, would come every day at the end of the day to pick her up. And he would wait, and she was respectful of him. He was respectful of her. It was clearly a strong family with really, really strong bonds. So she was everything I wanted to be and in my life. And so I feel a tremendous connection to her and very close. She still is my North Star.
Thank you so much for sharing those personal anecdotes. I think she's a North Star for so many of us on this call, as Dean Brown-Nagin said. I actually would like to turn back to Dean Brown-Nagin, and I want to show a clip in which one of Constance Baker Motley's former clients, the renowned journalist and activist Charlene Hunter Gold, who along with Hamilton Holmes helped to desegregate the University of Georgia, and one of Constance Baker Motley's proteges, the late and legendary Vernon Jordan, talk about the dangerous and substandard conditions in which she performed her exceptional and groundbreaking legal work. She once remarkably argued 4 appeals in a single day. Let's show the clip.
You have to admit this too. It was also dangerous because nobody ever knew what was going to happen when we walked out of those courtrooms, or when she walked into some place in Mississippi where everybody hated what she stood for. But you never, ever got the sense that she was afraid, or any of those lawyers were afraid, when fear would have been totally justifiable because it was a good reason for it.
In connection with the University of Georgia case, we had to go to Athens, Georgia, where the university was actually located, to go over the records again, to compare the applications of whites with the applications of Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes. And so we went through thousands of records, and we went there every day, I think for a couple of weeks. I stayed in Atlanta, and there was no place for us to stay in Athens, and Donald Howell had to get back to his office each day.
He was your local
Yes,
man.
And Vernon Jordan was my assistant. Vernon actually took over for Donald because Donald decided after a few days he couldn't go down there every day because it was like 100 miles from Atlanta. It took us 2 hours to drive down, 2 hours to drive back. We'd leave at 6 o'clock in the morning.
You could not stay in Athens.
That's right. So we left at 6 o'clock in the morning, and Vernon would drive.
It was fascinating to me to see this accomplished lawyer get in the car. She sat in the front seat with me. She would say good morning, and she'd be very pleasant. But as soon as she got in the car, she took her stuff out. And you never been to this kind of barber who strapped his razor on that to get it sharp. Well, as I'm driving, I'm watching her hit that razor scrap, getting ready for the direct examination, the cross-examination, anticipating in her own mind loopholes in our case, loopholes in the state's case. It was quite something to see. And then once you got in the courtroom, I'm sitting there at the table with she and Oliwell and Ward, and you see the value of that preparation.
So, Dean Brown-Nagin, as you have been researching for the Civil Rights Queen and writing that upcoming biography, and you follow the arc of her career from youth activist in the Negro Youth Council to her formative years as a litigator and legal strategist at LDF, where she was trial or appellate counsel for 57 cases in the US Supreme Court, 82 cases in federal courts of appeals, 48 cases in federal district courts and numerous state courts, to her stint in the political arena that we referenced as New York State Senator and Manhattan Borough President, to serving nearly 40 years as a federal judge. What would you say was her most defining role, and how did those experiences that Jordan and Charlene Hunter Gold just described in the South, how did they shape her vision?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question, Janae, and for those clips, which are so evocative of what she meant to her clients and also just the kind of person that she was and her expertise. You know, picking up on the theme of there were so many seasons to Judge Motley's career, and that's one of the things that really stands out about her. In each of the roles that she entered, she found a way for her values to be expressed, her values of the pursuit of opportunity for everyone. And so it's hard to say which of the roles is defining. I'll perhaps say a little bit about why each of them is special. And let me turn to her role in politics and the point about democracy. So she personified, helped us see the value of the passage of the Voting Rights Act for Black representation and Black power in her role as in the Senate and also as Manhattan Borough President. Now, those roles were limited in terms of duration, but really important, I would argue, for the way in which she used, say, as Manhattan Borough President, the budgetary process to ensure that imperative social welfare opportunities for the community were achieved. A very important point. People don't think about, actually, people today are thinking about the way in which budgets impact opportunity more forcefully, but Motley did that in that role. As a judge, it was really important for her to be appointed, for a Black woman to be appointed as a federal judge. And the controversy that she faced during her nomination illustrates that she was seen as a threat. At the same time, civil rights activists, women's rights activists were overjoyed when she was appointed, because there was this idea that, we have one of ours on the bench. And she is going to achieve so much through that role. And she did, including in areas that a lot of people don't know very much about. So in the criminal law context, she ruled an important case that solitary confinement is cruel and unusual. She ruled in cases and spoke out against the Rockefeller drug laws. She mentored a generation of lawyers, people like Sarah Moss, and really started to hire law clerks who were overlooked by other judges. And then just to conclude, her role as a civil rights lawyer is just so vitally important. And it has to be the one that I would choose if forced as definitive. And that's because, it is because of Constance Baker Motley that African-American students in the South were able to attend the University of Georgia, were able to attend Ole Miss, which was called the last battle of the Civil War. She was important to her clients for the opportunity, but also just the role modeling, and I think about her experiences with James Meredith, where she had to play multiple roles. So she's the lawyer in the courtroom, but she's also the counselor, because they went through traumas together. And so I would say that for all of those cases, Some we know about, some we don't know about, that she litigated as a lawyer. These are definitive. They really help make the society that we live in today, really helped us achieve a more perfect union.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. And I think what we can say is that she helped to define each of the roles that she played in her service. Professor Jones, I want to talk to you about your book, Vanguard, which explores the role of Black women in the fight for the right to vote and for broader principles of equality. There was such power in the work of these unsung heroes, not only in the rights that they were able to secure, but in how they defied racial and gender stereotypes. I want to play a clip from the trials of Constance Baker Motley, where she talks about the inferiority complex that segregation inculcated in Black children and in the psyche of Black people, and the power of Black lawyers representing those communities. It was not only the transformative change that they sought through law, but that they were the very embodiment of what was possible. Let's watch the clip.
This is an interview with Judge Constance Baker Motley on November 12th, 1977.
One of the results of segregation, as was argued in the Brown case, as you know, was that when the state set aside Black children in separate schools, this affected the ability of Black children to learn, because then they saw themselves as inferior people. And if you feel that you're inferior and can't learn, then of course that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, or it feeds on itself. And sure enough, you don't learn. So that one of the effects of segregation was to make Blacks feel inferior, because the reality for them was that they were inferior in the society. The white people were the privileged people, and they were underprivileged people. They could see, every Black child could see, that Blacks had less than whites, that Blacks were treated differently from whites, and therefore Black children grew up feeling that they were, in fact, inferior people. And that attitude manifested itself in many of our efforts to get Blacks to participate in these cases. They were fearful. They knew that the white community was powerful. They felt there was no hope.
So, Professor Jones, in this context and in the context of Black women in the civil rights movement, can you speak to what it meant, for example, to have Constance Baker Motley stand before a judge in an integrated federal court in the early 1960s and argue her case on behalf of a Black man, Meredith Fair, who wanted to integrate the University of Mississippi, which Dean Brown-Nagin said, Constance Baker Motley described as the last battle in the Civil War, or representing Black students seeking admission to the universities of Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and Clemson College in South Carolina. She seemed to be acutely aware of what her presence represented.
Thank you for that. I think that oftentimes when we revisit these cases, we rightly are focused on the merits of the cases, if you will, the young people, right, whose education is at stake in this litigation. And as well we should. But I think, and I thought this was underscored in that section of the film that emphasized the threat, the violence, right, that the retribution that is directed not only at the litigants, right, but at Judge Motley. That, for me, is evidence of the way in which each and every time she signed a brief, she stepped to a podium, she made an argument, she linked arms with a client, she embodied the refutation of the deep logics of Jim Crow, right? That there she was with stellar education, with a rigorous and excellent capacity for her craft, with a kind of courage, as we've heard, that was unshakable. This makes her the evidence, right, against the system that she challenges. And so here, it helps me to understand why she herself is targeted. And if I could say, she is embodying both a challenge to Jim Crow, right, and to anti-Black racism, but she also embodies that challenge to Jane Crow, right, and the ways in which Black women in particular, right, are being caricatured, denigrated, villainized, and more by the propaganda apparatus of Jim Crow in this period. She is the model for that. And the consequence of that is, of course, that she is inspiring, she is modeling, she is drawing out those young girls and women, particularly Black girls and women, who are witness, right, to her power, to her dignity, and more. In Vanguard, I talk about a young woman in Queens, New York, Lonnie Guinier, who goes on herself to be a civil rights litigator, a brilliant theorist of voting rights in her role at Penn and then Harvard Law Schools. Guinier tells the story, right, of seeing Constance Baker Motley on her television and recognizing her own purpose, right, in Motley's example. Guinier will go on to carve her own path and make her own way, but we cannot discount the ways in which Motley is both challenging Jim Crow by her very presence and inspiring the next generations of sheroes who will follow in her footsteps. It's extraordinary.
Extraordinary. She is the embodiment of intersectionality before we even had a term for it. So thank you for pointing that out so clearly. Sarah, I'm hoping you can focus on Constance Baker Motley's life as a jurist. We know that she was originally considered for the Second Circuit Court of Appeals to fill the seat that Thurgood Marshall vacated when he became Solicitor General, before, of course, heading to the Supreme Court. But that nomination was thwarted because no woman had ever occupied that position, let alone a Black woman. Even her appointment as a district judge, and please forgive the construction that's happening here, but even her appointment as a district judge wasn't without controversy. Let's turn to the clip of her meeting with President Johnson, in which she calls Senator Kennedy, who had delayed advancing her nomination.
In January 1966, I was just called and told to come to
the White House.
To the White House. The president said to me when I got in, well, we're going to announce your appointment to the bench today, and all the newspaper people are here. They'll be taking pictures, and I'm going to let them in a few minutes. I said, today? And he said, yes. Did you know? I said, no. He said, well, we don't have to do it today. I said, oh, no, it's all right. We'll do it today. Nobody told me. He liked these surprises, you know, and this was a well-guarded secret. Even I didn't know it was going to be announced. He had the newspaper people come in. They took all these pictures and blah, blah, blah. And then when they left, he picked up the telephone and he said to his secretary, get me Bobby Kennedy on the telephone.
I'll do it then sometime during the afternoon if that's agreeable. You work out whenever you can get the hearing set, and then you let her know, will you?
I've written you a personal letter today, which you go over there, but there's some material that I thought you might be interested in.
Good. I'd like to see you. Anytime you're free, you come down and let's have a visit. Would you like to say a word to her now? Do you have a time?
Sure, that'd be
Judge Motley, come over here and just come here and you can take it right here. Take it here at the desk.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Hello, Mr. Senator.
Oh, yeah, congratulations.
Well, thank you very much.
No, I'm very pleased for you.
Yes. I guess we'll get together on the confirmation soon.
Yes, that'll be fine. Well, there won't be any difficulty. So congratulations to you.
Well, thank you very much.
Nice to talk to you.
Yes, bye.
So, Sarah, one of the critiques was that her career as a civil rights attorney would constrain her impartiality. And that presumption didn't end when she was confirmed to the bench. One of the most well-known decisions from her tenure on the bench is one in which she was asked to recuse herself. It was one of the first Title VII sex discrimination cases, Blank versus Sullivan and Cromwell. And the assertion was that her race and sex and civil rights background would compromise her judgment. But folks like Dean Brown-Nagin have written that she is actually a judicial pragmatist. And I would like to hear from you. What do you think was the impact of her civil rights career on her as a judge?
Well, I was lucky enough to be the law clerk on Blank versus Sullivan and Cromwell. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But of course, her civil rights background was part of who she was. But she was fair. I mean, all of this is a bad rap, and I don't think it was justified at all because she was fair. She was a pragmatist. There were Title VII cases that she dismissed. She denied class action to women in several cases who were alleging discrimination. So she was a tough sentencer, actually. So in my experience, both looking at her cases and in my experience, she was fair. She looked at every case on the facts, on the law, and decided it that way. She discussed cases with us, and often we get to write a draft, and I did on Blank versus Sullivan and Cromwell. She did not have law clerks involved in sentencing because she felt that was really her obligation and responsibility. And as I said, she was a tough sentencer. So I think the rap on her is completely unfair because she was a serious judge who had that background. And as she said in the opinion in Blank, you know, if it were just the facts of her sex and the fact that she had a background, in this case in civil rights, every judge in the courthouse would be disqualified because every judge is one sex or a-sex and all have a background in something. And so, and they brought it up, they mandamus to the Second Circuit affirmed. So I think, frankly, it was sexism, racism that gave her that rap, and it was completely unfair.
Well, thank you for pointing that out. I absolutely agree. And I think her record on the bench proves it all and bears it out. I think we have time for a very quick question. And so I'm going to close it out with Dean Brown-Nagin and ask you to put on your dean cap and think about opportunity and higher education in the context of Constance Baker Motley's career. As we've mentioned, we are so proud that earlier this year we were able to launch a pipeline program in the name of Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley to provide wraparound support for prospective civil rights lawyers who want to work in the South and continue the unfinished business of the civil rights movement. Constance Baker Motley wanted to be a lawyer since she was very young, and she was not encouraged to pursue that path. She was instead encouraged to become a hairdresser. Thankfully, she was able to pursue a legal career thanks to the support of a benefactor. From your perspective, and very quickly, just in a few words, what would we have lost if Constance Baker Motley had not had the opportunity to fulfill her dream of becoming a lawyer?
All right. Thank you so much for that question, Janae, and for the fellowship, which I think is so important to spur access to higher education. You know, I think that Motley's life and achievements show that excellence can be found throughout humanity. It's opportunity that is in short supply. It's not excellence, it's opportunity. And so the kind of fellowships that LDF is offering are just vital so that we can find talent and nurture talent, find it and nurture it. Her life also, when I say, you know, she was excellent, I don't just mean natural ability. I mean that she did the work. She represents doing the work. putting your head down, acquiring the knowledge. There was a time when someone was complimenting her and saying how smart she was. And she actually said that, it wasn't that the civil rights lawyers were so smart. It was that the other side was reading about cases in a book and they were calling them off by heart, right? So doing the work. And we need so much to find people like Constance Baker Motley, nurture them, and ensure that they have access to higher education.
Absolutely. We all must do the work, and there's so much work to do. I want to thank you all for taking the time, Dean Brown-Nagin, Professor Jones, Sarah Moss, for your rich insights into Constance Baker Motley's legacy. This was such an excellent discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we end today's program, I'm delighted to introduce Associate Attorney General of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, Kristen Clark. She's former president of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and a former LDF attorney, and she will provide closing remarks.
I am so grateful to have the opportunity to join the NAACP Legal Defense Fund for this remarkable program celebrating the legacy and accomplishments of Constance Baker Motley, this incredible, fierce, and fearless Black woman. There is much in Constance Baker Motley's life that I can relate to personally. We're both the children of Caribbean immigrants. We both grew up in the Northeast. We both worked for this storied organization, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, even if in two different eras, yet committed to similar goals. And we both had our hard work and smarts recognized at an early age, setting us on very different life paths than many expected. But there's another way in which our lives were profoundly different. I was fortunate enough to grow up in an era when I could idolize one of the most important voices in civil rights history, Constance Baker Motley's. She was truly one of our nation's greatest civil rights legal pioneers. For generations, Black women like her have been the backbone of our national fight for progress, insisting again and again on the true meanings and values of democracy. And far too often, our contributions have been ignored or diminished. But it is simply impossible to diminish the accomplishments of Ms. Motley. Her legal strategies defined many of the core fights of the civil rights movement. The desegregation of public schools, colleges, and universities, the right of Black citizens to register and vote, the right to sit at lunch counters or access other public amenities like parks and museums, ensuring equal pay for Black teachers, protecting the right of Black citizens to serve on juries, the right to peacefully protest, and so much more. As Dr. Gary Ford observed in his biography of Motley, her tireless pursuit of equal justice under the law widened the circle of opportunity for Blacks, whites, women, and other groups that were discriminated against and denied equality in American society. With determination and a keen legal mind, Ms. Motley turned the gears of justice, and when those gears did not exist, she built them herself. In my role as the head of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice, I have seen firsthand how a truly engaged Justice Department can be a powerful tool to promote equal justice under law. But it's not always been that way. In her career, Constance Baker Motley urged the Justice Department to think boldly and more expansively about how to bring our nation closer to its ideals. She called on the Justice Department to bring more resources to bear to protect victims of discrimination, especially in the South. Much like Rosa Parks, she refused to take a back seat. She, Constance Baker Motley, believed deeply in our collective power to build a nation that truly guarantees liberty and justice for all. She believed that we could be the country we all dreamed of. As she reflected on the long struggle to force nationwide compliance with civil rights laws, Ms. Motley said, quote, "Our Constitution was put to the test and survived. Our country is stronger now for having had that demonstration of what the Constitution means in practical application. As we gather here to celebrate what would have been her 100th birthday, there is no question that our country is stronger now thanks to the courage, persistence, and sheer legal brilliance of the Honorable Constance Baker Motley. May she rest in peace. May her example inspire us all, and may her voice live on evermore.
Thank you, Attorney General Clark, for those powerful and moving remarks. It does us proud to witness the tradition of trailblazing women leaders continue at LDF, from Constance Baker Motley to you and Vanita Gupta in the Justice Department. And many thanks to Vice President Harris for her introductory remarks to set us right in thinking about the future of voting rights and democracy in our country and providing a powerful call to action. Thank you to LDS President and Director Counsel Sherilyn Ifill, to Joel Motley, Dean Brown-Nagin, Professor Jones, and Sarah Moss for their rich contributions to today's program. And I thank you for joining this celebration of Constance Baker Motley's life. I can think of no better way to close this event than ending with Judge Motley's own words. So please stick around to listen, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you again.
I know that I have been pointed out as the first Black woman to be in the New York State Senate, to be the president of the Borough of Manhattan, to be appointed to the federal court. Yes, I think I'm the first Black woman appointed to the federal bench. I've been the first Black woman to be the chief judge of a court. I know that there are many young Blacks who view me as a kind of role model. I am aware of that.
And you're glad about that?
Of course.
Final question. How would you describe yourself?
I'm a kind of person that I think works hard and gives every job that I have the best that I can. I think that at this juncture in my life, I feel that I have accomplished something. I don't have a feeling of, gee, I need to do something. I am perfectly happy to sit back and let other young people take the awards and the plaques and the honorary degrees and so forth. I have all that I want.